In the first part of our notes today, we're going to be reviewing place value of decimals and converting between fractions and decimals. So the first thing on your notes is just a table to show you place value as a reminder. So you could put any number in here where the decimal point is right here in the center where it's labeled decimal point, and whatever number would be in here would be how you would call that number. So for example, if I gave you the number 231.52, really the correct way of saying this number would be 231 and 52 hundredths, because we stopped with 2 spaces after our decimal point. Those are called our hundredths. So just as a review, go ahead and try to write these two numbers the way that they would be read. You can pause and try it and then check your answer once you've tried it on your own. So the first one should be written as 621 and 35 hundredths. So since we had 2 spaces after the decimal there, those decimal points are read as 35 hundredths. We're in that hundredths place there. And then the second one goes 4 spaces past our decimal point. So if you look back up at your table, the 4th space after the decimal is read as 10 thousandths. So to write that number, we're going to say the whole number, which is 4,125, but then after we write that out, we still need to say that this is the 10 thousandths, because if we just leave it without 10 thousandths, it would be a number that's greater than 1, but really this number is between 0 and 1. So this is just a review of our place value, and that'll help you when you're going to convert these decimals back into fractions. So in this table, these are some common fractions that you should try to remember. So if you're able to memorize them, that's great, but there is a way to remember them without having to memorize. So we'll show you the skills there. So just as a reminder, so that you can try to memorize these, 1/2, that's pretty simple, that's 0.5. 1/3, this is 0.3 repeating, and remember we put this bar over a number in a decimal spot to show that it's going to keep going on and on, it's never going to stop. Same with 2/3, it's 0.6 repeating, so it has that bar over it. 1/4 is 0.25. 1/4 is, there's another way of saying that, it's 1/4. So I remember that as 25 cents as a quarter for $1. 3/4 or 3/4 is 3/4 of $1, which would be 75 cents, or 0.75, 75 hundredths. In our next column for a denominator of 5, 1/5 is 0.2 or 2 tenths. 2/5 is 0.4 or 4 tenths. 3/5 is 0.6 or 6 tenths, and 4/5 would be 0.8 or 8 tenths. So the reason I'm saying them as 8 tenths, 6 tenths, 4 tenths, 2 tenths, if you were to rewrite 4/5, in an unsimplified fraction, that's the same as 8 over 10 or 8 tenths. That decimal form is said the same way. So if you're able to remember how the fractions are pronounced and how the decimals are pronounced, you'll be able to remember those fraction to decimals easier. Moving on to the eighths, so 1/8 is 0.125 or 125 thousandths. So to go from 1/8 to 3/8, if you can at least remember 1/8, just to get to 3/8, all we have to do is multiply this number by 3. When we do that, we get 0.375. Now I didn't put 2/8 here because 2/8 it would be simplified to 1/4, and we already had that as 0.25 or 25 hundredths. For 5/8 we have 0.625 or 625 thousandths, and then for 7/8 we have 0.875 or 875 thousandths. Moving into our ninths. The ninths are kind of an easy one to remember. 1/9 is 0.1 repeating. And I remember it as 0.11 repeating because for the nines, you can kind of think about like when you multiply something by 11, you're going to get that number doubled, right? So for 2/9, it's 0.2 repeating. So I'm thinking of the 0.11 was just multiplied by 2. So all of these ninths, you just take the number that's on top and you're going to keep repeating it. So for 4/9, it would be 0.4 repeating or 4 repeating. You can write it either way because the 4s are just going to keep going. 5/9 would be 0.5 repeating, 6/9 would be 0.6 repeating, and so on. Finally, we have our tenths, and we kind of already saw this when we did our 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5. So 1/10, remember we would just say 0.1 as 1/10 because this 1 is in the tenths place. 2/10 is read as 2/10 as a decimal as well because 2 is in the tenths place. 3/10 is 0.3, 3/10, and 4/10 is 0.4 or 4/10. And you can kind of see the pattern as it would go along in the tenths column. So these are good to memorize, but if you forget, there is a way to figure those out. So in case you aren't remembering what the fraction's decimal form is, you could either, like I just said, say the decimal, say the fraction and think about, okay, well, what would that look like in decimal form? Or you can always use long division to convert the fraction into a decimal. Now, everyone doesn't like long division, but it's something that we would have to do if we can't remember. So just as a refresher for long division, you're first going to take the number that's on top, and you're going to put it inside, and then you're going to divide it by the number on the bottom. So we're taking 3 and dividing it into 4. But we know that 4 can't go into 3 on its own. That's why this is a fraction, and we have to figure out what its decimal form is. So in order to do that, we put a decimal on top, and then we put a 0, because since we added this decimal, we're allowed to move a place value over on this number inside. So now we can say, okay, well, how many times does 4 go into 30? And 4 goes into 30 7 times. 7 times 4 is 28, and then we subtract 30 minus 28. That leaves us with 2. Then we take our 4 down again and we repeat the process. But again, we're having this dilemma of, okay, well, 4 can't go into 2. So since you added a decimal here, you're allowed to continue to add zeros here. This 0 is going to come down, and now we have 4 into 20. 4 goes into 20 5 times. 5 times 4 is 20. And when we subtract, we get a remainder of 0, which means we're done dividing. So we can say that the decimal form of 3/4 is 0.75 or 75 hundredths. So if you forget, you can always do long division. I want you to pause the video and try these 3 other problems showing your work for all of the long division, just as a good practice in case you get to your test and you kind of can't remember what to do, then this will be a good backup. Okay, hopefully you tried these on your own. Let's review them. If we're doing 5/6, that's 5 divided by 6. So 5 goes inside, 6 goes outside. 6 can't go into 5, so we add our decimal and add our 0. Now 6 can go into 50 8 times. 8 times 6 is 48. We subtract, we get a remainder of 2, so we're not done. We have to add another 0, and 6 can go into 20 3 times. That makes 18. And when we subtract here, we're just left with 2. So we were left with 2 before, so that means that we're just going to keep getting a remainder of 2. That's going to tell us that we're going to continuously be getting a 3 up here. So we could write this as 0.83 and put a repeat bar just over the 3, because it's not the 8 that's repeating every time, it's just the 3. So you have to write 8, and then it would be 3, 3, 3, 3, 3 continuously forever. So just make sure you're writing the repeat part only over the 3 there. Moving on to 5/9, we would be dividing 5 by 9. We add our decimal up top, and that lets us add a 50. 9 times 5 is 45. When we subtract, we get a remainder of 5. So again, we now have to go 9 into 5. We're just going to continuously be dividing 9 into 5. So that means that our 5 is just going to keep repeating itself. And we talked about how the ninths repeat themselves. It's just that number repeating. So 0.5 repeating would be 5/9. The last one here is 7/8, so 7 divided by 8. First add your decimal and then add your 0. 8 times 8 is 64. When we subtract, we get a remainder of 6. Then we can bring down another 0. 8 goes into 60 7 times, and that's 56. We subtract and get a remainder of 4. 8 goes into 40 5 times, and 5 times 8 is exactly 40, which means we have a remainder of 0, and now our decimal is complete. So this decimal finally ends. We don't have a repeating one this time. So 7/8 can be written as 875 thousandths. So this is just a good way to remember your fractions into decimals, and in case you can't memorize the list, totally fine. That you always have the backup of using long division when you don't have a calculator for this topic. Moving on to our opposite direction then. So we were just putting fractions into decimals, but what if you start with a decimal and you want to put it into a fraction? So we first want to talk about the kind of decimals that stop. So terminating decimals are decimals that do not repeat. They stop or they end. So it was like in our example right above, our first problem ended, 3/4 was a terminating decimal, and 7/8 was a terminating decimal. Whereas the middle two problems that we had were repeating because we needed those repeat bars there. So for a terminating decimal, you're going to put the number that's in the tenths, hundredths, thousandths place in a fraction over 10, 100, or 1,000, etc. Then you'll put the fraction in simplest form. So remember, 0.4, we can say that's called 4/10. There's only one number behind our decimal, and it's in the tenths place, so I'm going to put 4 over 10. This fraction is not completely simplified. They're both divisible by 2, so we can rewrite it as 2/5, and that would be our simplest form. Here we have 44 hundredths, or 0.44. So 44 is what we have behind the decimal, and it's in the hundredths place, so we put it over 100. When we simplify this, they're both divisible by 4. So 44 divided by 4 is 11, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. So 11/25. Finally, this one, 444 thousandths, where it's 444 behind the decimal, and it's in the thousandths place, so we put it over 1,000. These are, again, both divisible by 4, so 111 200 over 250. So 111 2/50ths is how we would say that. So that would be our fraction, and that's how you change your decimals that are terminating into fractions. Now, if you have decimals that are repeating, so they have a repeat bar over them, instead of putting them over 10, you're now going to put them over 9. So just think back to when we had our 1/9, 2/9. Those were just that number over 9, and we said that that was at that number that was repeating. So here, if I have 0.4 repeating, I put the number behind the decimal over that many 9s. In this case, there's only one number, so I'm going to put 1 9. And 4/9 is in simplest form, so I'm done. In my next example, I have 0.2 repeating. So again, I'm going to do 22 because that's what I see behind my decimal, and then I'm going to put it over 99 because there were 2 spaces after my decimal. These are both divisible by 11, so I can rewrite this as 2/9 in simplest form. Finally, we have 134 thousandths repeating itself. So I put 134 over 999, and this is in simplest form for its fraction. So with repeating decimals, put them over 9, 99, 999, etc. When you have your terminating decimals, read them properly and then put them over that tens value that you have.